On the bottom of our planet lies the frigid land of Antarctica.
It was supposed to be that they would go in December, January, February, and March, and there was a list of military goals that they were to achieve. But by the end of February, something happened.
The Southern Ocean is one of the most isolated and unexplored places on the entire planet. A freezing, storm-battered stretch of water surrounding Antarctica, where very few people go and even fewer stay for long. But the ones who do keep reporting the same terrifying thing: a giant, pale figure moving beneath the surface with arms, with a head, with the unmistakable humanoid body proportions, except far, far larger than any human has any right to be. Could something unknown really be hiding beneath the ice at the bottom of the world? And why did the witnesses all describe the same impossible shape? Join us as we dive into one of the ocean's most unsettling and unexplained mysteries. The name that shocked the world. The word itself is the first strange thing about this story. When sailors began describing what they had seen beneath the surface of the Southern Ocean, they did not reach for the kind of name you might expect. They did not call it a sea monster. They did not compare it to a dragon, a demon, or any creature pulled from the old books of mythical beasts. Instead, they chose a word so simple it almost feels wrong. They called it ninjin. In Japanese, that word means one thing and one thing only: human. Not almost human, not human-like, just human. A plain and ordinary word that people use every single day to describe themselves, and the people standing next. To them, the same word a child might use when asked to draw a person. The same word carved into the most basic idea of what a living, thinking, breathing creature looks like. That choice tells us something important, because the people who named this creature were not trying to make it sound exotic or terrifying. They were trying to describe exactly what they saw. Something that looked, in its most essential shape, like one of us, just much larger and impossibly far from anywhere people are supposed to be. Think about what it means to look over the side of a ship at the edge of the world, surrounded by freezing black water and floating ice, and to see something enormous staring back that reminds you of yourself. Not a fin, not a tail, not the familiar curve of a whale rolling beneath the surface, but a shape with a head, a shape with arms, a shape with the kind of proportions a person has. Whatever these witnesses saw, the name they gave it reflects something deeper than a simple sighting. It reflects recognition, the disturbing feeling that what was down there in the dark and the cold was not entirely foreign, that it wore a shape the human eye already knew how to read. The ninjin exists at the point where the ocean stops feeling like a different world and starts feeling like a mirror. That name has stayed attached to the legend ever since, but before the story could grow, people had a very reasonable question: is any of this actually real? Fact versus legend. That is the question sitting at the center of everything. The honest answer, based on what science has confirmed so far, is no. There is no verified specimen, no biological sample sitting in a laboratory anywhere in the world, no authenticated photograph that has passed serious scientific scrutiny. No research institution has officially recorded an encounter with a giant humanoid creature in Antarctic waters. And the ninjin does not appear in any accepted catalog of known marine life. By every measurable standard available, the ninjin is a legend. That should be the end of the conversation, because in most cases, when something has no physical evidence behind it, the story fades. People move on. The reports stop coming in. The forums go quiet, and the mystery gets filed away alongside other things that turned out to be nothing. But that is not what happened with the Ninja. The reports kept coming. Not just once or twice, not from a single unreliable source. Accounts continued surfacing across years, across different locations in the Southern Ocean, from different crews on different vessels, and the description stayed remarkably consistent. A pale shape beneath the water, something large, something with a recognizably human outline, something that moved in a way that ice and ordinary marine life do not. The story refused to disappear, and that is what makes it worth examining carefully. Legends that survive tend to survive for a reason. Sometimes that reason is purely emotional. Some stories simply frighten people in a way that feels good, the way a campfire tale does, and so they get passed along. But sometimes a legend persists because the people telling it genuinely believe what they experienced, and because the experience itself resists easy explanation. The Ninja sits in that uncomfortable space between those two possibilities. It is not confirmed. It is not dismissed outright by everyone who has looked into it seriously. It exists in the gray area that sits between hard fact and pure imagination. Before deciding what to make of the evidence, or the lack of it, it helps to understand the place where all of this is supposed to be happening, because the Southern Ocean is not like other oceans. It is something else entirely, and the environment itself may explain more about this legend than any photograph ever could. The ocean at the end of the world. If you were going to hide something enormous, something that did not want to be found, there are very few places on Earth better suited to the task than the Southern Ocean. It sits at the bottom of the world, wrapping itself around Antarctica in a continuous belt of freezing, churning water, with no land to interrupt it and no calm seasons to soften it. Just an endless cycle of storms rolling around the planet, building strength as they go, crashing into anything unfortunate enough to be caught out there. Waves in the Southern Ocean can reach heights that would make experienced sailors grip whatever is nearest. And the wind does not gust so much as it howls constantly, as though the ocean itself is music, trying to push people away. The temperature alone makes it deeply hostile to human presence, with surface water cold enough to kill an unprotected person in minutes, and conditions that shift from dangerous to fatal with very little warning. Ice floats in vast sheets and jagged chunks across enormous stretches of the surface, some pieces the size of buildings, some the size of small countries, all of it moving slowly and unpredictably on currents that have been circling the planet for thousands of years. Below the surface, the picture becomes even more extreme, because the Southern Ocean drops to depths that have barely been touched by human exploration. Vast underwater canyons and plains stretching away into darkness, so complete that sunlight never reaches it. Large portions of the seafloor beneath these waters remain poorly mapped even now, meaning that science has a clearer picture of the surface of the moon than it does of what lies at the bottom of some of these depths. The ocean covers an area larger than most people can genuinely picture, roughly 20 million square kilometers of water. Most of it untouched, most of it unobserved, most of it simply existing in total isolation from the rest of the world. There are no shipping lanes cutting through its heart, no tourist routes, no commercial fishing fleets making regular passes across its deepest stretches. The only people who spend significant time in the Southern Ocean are scientists on research voyages, crew members aboard government survey vessels, and the occasional adventurer who has significantly underestimated what they signed up for. That isolation matters enormously when thinking about the Ninja, because an ocean this vast, this deep, this hostile to observation, is exactly the kind of place where something unknown could theoretically exist without ever being catalogued, measured, or confirmed. New species are still being pulled from these waters with surprising regularity. Creatures that science had no record of living in conditions that seem impossible, found only because a net or a camera happened to reach the right depth at the right moment. The Southern Ocean does not give up its secrets easily, and the people who know that better than anyone are the ones who have actually spent time out there, on the water, watching. The men who claimed they saw it. The witnesses are one of the most important parts of this story, music, because the Ninja is not a legend built on the testimony of frightened tourists or excitable children. It is built largely on accounts from people who work at sea for a living, people who know the difference between a wave and a living thing, between a sheet of floating ice and something moving with deliberate purpose. Research vessels operate in the Southern Ocean on a regular basis, carrying scientists, technicians, and experienced maritime crew whose music, entire professional lives are built around careful, accurate observation. Because in an environment that hostile, misidentifying something is not just an embarrassing mistake, it can be a genuinely dangerous one. If you think a wall of ice is something else, if you misjudge the movement of a large object in the water near your hull, the consequences can be severe. These are people trained to look at the ocean and read it correctly. Survey crews share a similar background, spending long periods at sea, making detailed records of conditions, marine life, and ocean features, building up the kind of music, patient, methodical familiarity with Southern Ocean environments that takes years to develop. When someone with that level of experience says they saw something they cannot explain, it carries a different weight than a casual claim made by someone who rarely leaves land. What makes the witness accounts particularly difficult to dismiss is not just who is making them, but how they describe their own reaction in the moment. Because almost universally, the people reporting Ninja sightings describe a period of disbelief first, a moment where they tell themselves it must be ice, or an unusual wave formation, or a known marine animal viewed from a strange angle. They look for the rational explanation before they allow themselves to consider that something else might be happening. It is only when the object continues behaving in a way that none of those explanations can account for that the witnesses begin to reconsider what they are actually looking at. And by that point, the feeling that sets in is described in remarkably consistent terms across multiple accounts. A kind of deep, quiet unease that sits music, differently from ordinary surprise. Something closer to the feeling of realizing you are not alone in a place where you were absolutely certain you were. The crews do not tend to report hysteria or panic. They report confusion, followed by a very deliberate, careful second look, followed by the unsettling conclusion that what is in the water does not match anything in their experience. That consistency across people who do not know each other, working on different vessels in different years, in different stretches of the same vast ocean, is something that supporters of the Ninjan legend return to again and again as their strongest point. But consistency in the telling is one thing. The actual content of what these witnesses describe is something else entirely, because the encounters follow a pattern so consistent it is difficult to ignore. The sightings. Almost every account begins the same way, with something in the water that the crew initially dismisses as ice because the Southern Ocean is full of floating ice in every shape and size imaginable. And the human eye learns to filter it out after enough time at sea, treating it as background the same way a person living near a railway learns to stop hearing the trains. So when something pale and large appears on or just beneath the surface, the first instinct is always to file it under the same category. Ice, unremarkable, move on. It is only when the object begins to move that the dismissal stops working. Ice drifts, it follows the current. It responds to the push of wind and water in ways that experienced sailors read almost unconsciously. And when something in the water stops behaving the way ice behaves, when it shifts direction music against the current, when it moves with a kind of slow deliberateness that has nothing to do with the forces acting on the surface around it, the brain starts paying a different kind of attention. Witnesses describe the shape resolving out of the water gradually, the way a picture comes into focus. First a pale mass, then something longer than expected, then something with a structure to it that the eye begins to organize into recognizable parts. A rounded shape at one end that sits like a head. Elongated forms extending from the sides that carry the proportions of arms rather than fins. A body length that witnesses consistently describe as enormous. Some accounts placing it at the length of the vessel they are standing on, which in the case of research and survey ships can mean something between 40 and 100 m from end to end. Some witnesses stop there, describing only the outline, the scale, and the movement. But others go further, reporting details that push the encounter into genuinely disturbing territory. Hands at the ends of the arms, individual fingers visible beneath the surface, and in some accounts, a face, pale and featureless, except for dark eyes positioned in approximately the right place for a human face, looking upward toward the hull of the ship. Then, without exception, the creature descends, slipping back into the darkness beneath the surface with a slowness that the witnesses find almost worse than if it had moved quickly, because something moving slowly is something that is not afraid, something that is choosing to leave rather than being startled into retreat. By the time anyone thinks to reach for a camera or call others to the railing, the water has closed over it, and there is nothing left but open ocean. A pale shape already dissolving into depth and darkness, leaving the witness standing at the rail with nothing to show for what they just experienced. The accounts exist, the witnesses exist, but the question of where the legend actually came from and how it reached the rest of the world is a story of its own. How the legend spread. The Ninjan did not begin as a headline. It did not break through a news broadcast or appear in a scientific journal. It started the way many modern legends start, quietly, in corners of the internet where people gather to share things that do not fit neatly into the official version of the world. Japanese internet forums were the first real home of the Ninjan story. Online spaces where users posted accounts, theories, and descriptions of the creature in threads that grew longer and stranger as more people added to them. Each new post pulling in someone else who claimed to have heard something similar, or knew someone who had, or had found a fragment of an account that seemed to match what the others were describing. The name Ninjan emerged from these forums, attached to the creature through collective agreement, rather than any single official source. A community decision that this thing, whatever it was, deserved a name, and that the name should be the plainest possible one, human, because that was the most honest description available. From the Japanese forums, the story moved outward, picked up by international paranormal encrypted communities who translated the accounts, added their own commentary, and spread them across a much wider audience. The legend arriving in new languages carrying the same essential shape it had always had, a pale giant beneath Antarctic waters, moving like something alive, looking like something familiar. Photographs began appearing alongside the stories. Blurry images pulled from satellite maps, ambiguous shapes in freezing water that could be read as almost anything, depending on how much the viewer wanted to see something. And for a significant portion of the audience, the desire to see something was considerable. The images circulated widely, collected and reposted across forums, blogs, and early social media platforms, each share carrying the story a little further music from its origins. The spread of the legend was also helped by the fact that it asked a question people found genuinely difficult to answer with complete confidence, because dismissing it required a certainty about the contents of the Southern Ocean that science music does not actually possess. And that uncertainty left just enough space for the story to breathe. Supporters of the Ninjan were quick to point that out, and their argument, when laid out carefully, is harder to brush aside than it might first appear. The case for the Ninjan. The people who believe in the Ninjan are not simply refusing to think clearly. They are pointing at a set of facts that are genuinely difficult to argue with and building a case from those facts that deserves to be taken seriously even by those who remain unconvinced. The first and most straightforward point is the consistency of the accounts. Because witnesses separated by years, by thousands of kilometers of ocean, and by any possibility of coordinating their stories, keep describing the same essential thing. A pale, enormous, humanoid shape moving beneath the surface of the Southern Ocean music, with the kind of slow deliberateness that does not belong to ice or to any known marine animal. Consistency across independent witnesses is something science takes seriously in other contexts, and the supporters of the Ninjan argue there is no obvious reason to abandon that principle here simply because the subject matter is uncomfortable. The second point is the ocean itself, because the Southern Ocean is not a well-understood environment. Large portions of it remain poorly explored. The deepest stretches of its underwater geography are still being mapped. and new marine species continue to be discovered in its waters with a regularity that should give anyone pause before declaring with confidence that nothing unknown could possibly be living there. The ocean has surprised scientists before, repeatedly, and in much shallower and better observed waters than these. The third point concerns scale, because the history of zoology is full of creatures that were dismissed as legend before physical evidence was eventually found. The giant squid was considered a sailor's fantasy for centuries before specimens began washing ashore. The colossal squid was unknown to science until the 20th century, and large unknown animals have continued to surface from deep water environments long after people assumed the age of discovery was finished. None of this proves the ninja exists. Supporters are generally careful to acknowledge that, but it establishes that the possibility cannot be ruled out on the basis of the ocean being too well known, because it simply is not in the places where the sightings occur. The argument is a reasonable one, but reasonable arguments deserve reasonable scrutiny, and the skeptical case against the ninja is built on foundations that are just as solid. The skeptical explanation. The skeptics are not dismissing the witnesses. They are offering a different explanation for what those witnesses actually saw. And the explanation they offer is grounded in well-understood science that applies directly to the conditions of the Southern Ocean. The first and most powerful tool in the skeptical case is pareidolia, the tendency of the human brain to find familiar patterns in random shapes, particularly faces and bodies, because the brain is wired from birth to recognize human forms faster and more readily than almost any other shape. It is an instinct built deep into the way people process visual information, and it operates whether the viewer wants it to or not. In an environment full of strangely shaped ice, low and shifting light, reflective water surfaces, and the visual distortion caused by cold air sitting above freezing water, the conditions for pareidolia are almost perfect. A mass of pale ice seen through churning gray water at an angle in poor visibility can resolve very convincingly into something that the brain insists looks human. Not because it is, but because the brain is doing exactly what it was built to do. The second factor is the physical and psychological state of the witnesses themselves, because the Southern Ocean is not just a difficult environment physically, it is a psychologically demanding one. Long periods of isolation, disrupted sleep patterns caused by the extreme light conditions near the poles, the constant low-level stress of operating in a genuinely dangerous environment, and the accumulated fatigue of weeks or months at sea, all affect the reliability of human perception in ways that are well documented and consistently underestimated by the people experiencing them. A tired, isolated person in a hostile environment is significantly more likely to misread ambiguous visual information than a rested, calm person on familiar ground. And the Southern Ocean produces tired, isolated people as a matter of routine. The third factor is the nature of Antarctic ice itself, which forms in extraordinary shapes under the influence of wind, current, wave action, and temperature change, producing formations that from certain angles and distances bear a striking resemblance to limbs, torsos, and rounded, head-like forms. Ice that moves slowly on a current can appear briefly and convincingly to be moving with purpose. The skeptical explanation does not call the witnesses liars. It calls them human, which may be the most honest assessment available, but it still leaves one uncomfortable question sitting unanswered. The problem with the evidence. Every investigation eventually arrives at the same place, the evidence. And with the Ninjin, that is where the story becomes genuinely difficult to resolve, because what exists is not nothing, but it is also very far from enough. The photographs are the most obvious starting point because photographs exist. They have been circulating alongside the legend since the story first began spreading through online forums. Pale shapes captured in satellite imagery, blurry outlines in freezing water, ambiguous forms that sit just at the edge of what the eye can confidently interpret. And that ambiguity is precisely the problem, because a photograph that could be almost anything is not evidence of any one specific thing. None of the images associated with the Ninjin have passed music, serious scientific scrutiny. None have been authenticated by independent analysts in a way that rules out natural explanations. And several of the most widely shared images have been traced back to satellite map screenshots, where the shapes in question are almost certainly unusual ice formations, viewed from above in conditions that flatten perspective and strip away the contextual information that would make identification straightforward. The absence of biological evidence is even more significant because the ocean gives things up. Not always, not reliably, but over time the physical traces of large marine animals tend to surface through strandings, through material caught in nets, through samples retrieved during research dives, through the accumulated work of decades of scientific observation in even the most remote waters. And in all of that time, across all of that work, nothing has ever been recovered from the Southern Ocean that points toward a large humanoid creature living beneath its surface. Not a tissue sample, not a fragment of bone, not an impression, not a track, nothing. What the evidence creates is atmosphere rather than confirmation. It builds a feeling. It sustains a question. It keeps the conversation alive, but it does not settle anything. And in science, a question kept alive by atmosphere alone is a question that remains unanswered. There is also the matter of how the legend has grown over time, because stories that begin with genuine ambiguity tend to accumulate details as they spread, each retelling adding something the previous version did not have. The hands, the fingers, the face, the eyes. Features appear more frequently and more vividly in later accounts than in earlier ones, which follows the pattern of legend building rather than the pattern of independent corroboration. The evidence, taken honestly, creates more questions than it answers. But questions are not always a dead end. Sometimes they point towards something music that matters far beyond the creature itself. Why the Ninjin still haunts us. The Ninjin should not still be a conversation by the standards normally applied to unverified creatures. It should have faded by now, filed away alongside dozens of other cryptids. That music briefly captured attention before the evidence failed to materialize and the interest moved on. But it has not faded, and understanding why tells us something true about the way human beings relate to the unknown. The legend survives in part because of where it is set. Because the Southern Ocean is not a backdrop that makes claims feel less plausible. It is one of the few places remaining on Earth where the honest answer to the question of what lives there is genuinely incomplete. The depths beneath those freezing waters have not been fully explored. The species catalog is still being written, and the environment actively resists the kind of sustained observation that would allow science to say with confidence that something large and unknown could not be present. That uncertainty is real. It is not invented by believers. It is simply the current state of knowledge about one of the least accessible places on the planet. But the deeper reason the Ninja endures has less to do with marine biology and more to do with the specific shape of the fear it represents. Because the creature does not frighten people the way a shark frightens them or the way a storm does. It frightens people in a quieter and more persistent way, the way a mirror in a dark room does. Because what the witnesses describe is not a monster in the traditional sense. It is something that looks like us, enormous and pale and silent, moving through a part of the world where nothing human should be, looking upward from the darkness with a face that the brain recognizes before the mind can decide whether it wants to. That combination, the unknown ocean and the human shape within it, reaches into something that facts and explanations do not easily touch. It sits in the part of the imagination that was never fully convinced that the deep water is empty. The part that has always suspected the darkness at the bottom of things contains something that has not yet been named. The Ninja is a legend built from isolation, from the limits of human knowledge, and from the ancient unease of looking into something vast and feeling for just a moment that something vast is looking back. The evidence has not confirmed it. The science has not validated it, but the question has not gone away either. And perhaps that is the most honest place to leave it, because when you imagine that pale shape moving beneath Antarctic waters, only you can decide whether you are looking at misidentified ice or something waiting in a part of the world we still do not fully understand. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.